Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is the story about Naruto. What if Naruto has steel release? Part 4. Hope you'll enjoy this video. So before we start, please do support for more awesome content and also hit the subscribe button and share this video with your friends. And also support the creator of this fanfic. I have created many playlists, check it out in the channel. So let's start the video. He looked about wildly, blue eyes darting left and right, trying to orient himself after the sudden shift in his perception. Rough stone walls surrounded him, paths leading off to either side. Pale luminescent glow outlining everything, coming from seemingly nowhere and everywhere. He shook his head, trying to piece his memories together. Hazy images of a bridge and someone in a mask drifted in and out of his mind, but he couldn't pull them together into anything solid. Suddenly there was a voice behind his shoulder, a light whispering that he couldn't understand, warm breath tickling his ear. He whirled around, eyes wide. No one was there. He heard the whispering once more, echoing from further down the corridor. It was leading him on, guiding him down one particular path. He followed the whispering voice because it was the only thing he could think to do in this strange unknown place. He followed it through tunnels, around corners, past dark branching passageways, until the background lighting brightened, and he found himself standing at the entrance to a large cavern. "Eh-chan, you've come back." There was a girl running towards him from across the cavern. She looked to be 8 or 9 and wore a frilled red skirt matched by a red vest over a short-sleeved white shirt. Under a white mop hat with a tattered red ribbon, her bob of short blonde hair bounced wildly as she ran. What caught his attention most were her eyes, scarlet red surrounding pools of dark vermilion in the center. "Come on, let's play." She had caught up to him and was dragging him back to the center of the cavern with a vice-like grip on his hand. "Eh?" he replied lamely. He didn't know who she was, where this place was, or how he had even gotten here. For that matter, his mind kept drawing a blank when he tried to think of who he was. "You're the demon." He felt his blood run cold and his feet halted in mid-step, though he didn't know the reason why. The girl turned to look at him with a quizzical expression and then pulled him along with a surprising strength until he found himself in the center of the large cavern. "We're going to play Kagam Kagam. You're going to be the demon." He let out the breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Kagam Kagam. He was familiar with the children's game. He didn't remember ever having played it, but the rules came to him as if he had watched others playing many times. The person who was chosen to be the demon sat in the center, blindfolded. The others then joined hands and walked in a circle around the demon while singing. "How?" he asked, pushing aside his past confusion temporarily for this new one. "There aren't enough people." She gave him a wide grin that showed off a set of gleaming white teeth. Then the air around her shimmered, and he was startled to find himself looking at 12 identical copies of the girl standing behind her. Small hands pressed down on his shoulders, pulling him down from behind until he found himself seated on a chair that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The hands then moved up his face, fingertips lightly brushing his cheeks until they made their way to his hair. They moved back down, pulling something with them, and his vision was replaced with pitch blackness. There was light shuffling all around him, the girls forming a circle. Then they began to sing, a chorus of light feminine voices spinning around him. "Kagam Kagam, the bird in the cage, when will it come out? In the evening of the dawn, the crane and turtle fell. Who stands behind you now?" "I don't know." He didn't know how else he was supposed to answer, as she'd never told him her name. The girl giggled, a high-pitched titter that began behind but spread all around him. Then abruptly, as if at some hidden signal, they all stopped. He had just parted his lips to say something when he felt a slight tugging in his navel. The feeling bloomed until it felt as if his entire body was being pulled inwards on itself. As quickly as it began, the feeling stopped, and he was overcome by a sudden sensation of change. It took him several seconds before his mind caught up with the signals various parts of his body were sending about their new positions, watery eyes blinking from the sudden influx of light the whole while. He wasn't sitting in the center of the circle anymore, though he hadn't felt himself being moved at all. Instead, it was the girl seated in the chair, mop hat tilted down over her face to cover her eyes. He was directly behind her, where she had been a moment ago. He was now part of the circle imprisoning her, holding hands in a chain circle with a dozen identical copies of himself. "Naruto. Uzumaki Naruto is behind me," the girl declared proudly as she jumped out of the chair. His hazy memories suddenly took on solidity as she called out his name. Scenes flashed before him in a jumbled torrent of sounds and colors, of thoughts and feelings. He found himself nearly overwhelmed as 12 years of memories flooded back into his consciousness all at once. He closed his eyes tightly and put his head in his hands, trying to pick out the most relevant images so he could make sense of his current situation. This was a dream, he realized, one he'd experienced before. He remembered he had the same dream a year ago, of the cavern and the little girl, just before his empty left eye socket grew an unnatural red eye. Gigi had told him that the first dream was a visual manifestation of his mind, so this one must be the same thing. But why was he dreaming now? Images of a bridge and a masked girl came to the surface of his consciousness again, but this time took on a new importance as his mind attached other memories to them. He remembered being on the bridge, fighting the hunter Nin. There was the glint of, a flash of her fist just missing his face, the kick, and the overwhelming pain, and then nothing. Was he dead? No, he corrected himself, he couldn't be dead. At least not yet. If this dream was like the last, then he was in his mind. He was probably unconscious, stuck in his own mind, while his team fought without him. He had to find a way out. His team was fighting while he was passed out. He had to wake up and help his team. Mind cleared and memories sorted, he opened his eyes and lifted his head again. He found himself looking into the girl's red eyes. She had moved in front of him while he was sorting out his thoughts and was now standing bent forward with her head upturned to look into his face. He noticed absently that the chair and all his clones had disappeared as well. It was just the two of them again. Chan, look. I got out of the cage, the girl said with a playful grin on her face. Cage? He asked uncertainty. We were playing, remember? I'm the demon, and I got out of the cage. It took several seconds for the full implications of her words to register in his mind. You're Kyuubi, and you're loose? The what? The thing with all the tails? Oh no, I'm much cuter than that thing. Or at least I was. She let her voice drift off, eyes looking to the side and face scrunched up in contemplation. That thing? If you're not Kyuubi, then what happened to it? We ate it. Someone told us to eat it, and we did. It was really icky though, and tasted like rotten meat. We? She simply pointed to her right in response. His eyes followed her gesture, the lighting in the cavern spreading as his gaze moved. He found himself looking at the familiar web of chains with the paper seal attached to the center. The scene was identical to what he remembered from the last dream, with one difference. What happened to the bones in there? He asked as he turned back to the girl. My other self? I let it out. It's using your body now, Chan. You don't need it anymore. His voice trailed off. What did she mean? Was he really dead? Then why was he here and not in? The girl interrupted his thoughts, speaking as she jogged in lazy circles with her arms outstretched, tilting left and right as if she were a bird. I was watching that fight, you know, I can see what your eye sees. You really suck, Chan. That one Chan was about to break you. Break me? What do you mean? One Chan did something to you that made red stuff come out of your mouth and made your chest all like this. She flapped one hand back and forth at the wrist to indicate her point. I fixed your body though. Wouldn't it be nice to let it play with something that's broken? Have you healed me? Then you can wake me up and put me back in control of my body? Chan. You don't need it anymore, remember? You're dead. I'm dead? You're lying, I can't be dead. This is a dream, just like last time. I'm in my mind again. I can't be dead if I'm just dreaming. This isn't a dream, not really. But you are in your mind. Out there your body's still moving, but it's not yours anymore. What? You can't just take my body. Why not? If I hadn't fixed it, you would be dead out there. Just be happy I'm letting you play some games here with me before you go away forever. Go away forever? Pretty soon you'll be gone, poof. She threw her hands upwards and outwards as if to imitate an explosion. People can't live without a body, you know. Your mind just hasn't realized that you're dead yet. But you can't let me die, he stammered in response as his tone started becoming hysterical. If I die, you die too. That's what the seal does. You said you healed my body, so you have to put me back, or we'll both die. She poked him in the chest with one finger and laughed before turning away to jog in circles with arms stretched out again. You haven't been paying attention, have you, Chan? Maybe the seal would have killed the thing with the tails when you died, but do you see any tails on me? But you can't just, it's still my body. Even if you did heal me, you can't just do what you want. You have no right to take it. In some corner of his mind, he knew that his words sounded feeble. But he couldn't think of anything else to say. He felt as if the logical foundations of his existence were crumbling around him. The girl stopped in her tracks and turned to meet his gaze. Her red eyes took on an unnatural cold depth. Her mouth, still curved upwards with a smile, twisted into a deranged parody of childlike innocence. To him it seemed as if her face, while still retaining the basic form of humanity, had subtly shifted in such a way so that the parts taken together could no longer be described as a human facial expression. Without conscious thought, he took an involuntary step back at the sight. Your body? No. We've been trapped here as long as you've been alive, and I've been bored for 12 years while you got to have a life. If I hadn't fixed your body, it would still be broken, and you would have died anyway. If I didn't allow it, neither you nor it could use the body. The way I see it, that means the body is mine as much as yours. You're lying. You don't control my body like that, he insisted stubbornly. She laughed at him, a sharp, demented cackle that only underscored just how alien her appearance had become. Then why can't you wake up from your dreams until I let you? Why can't you take your body back now? How could I give your body my own eye? He watched, horrified, as her left hand reached up to her face and dug into her eye socket. With a sickening squelch, she pulled her left eye out of her head. Her tongue flicked over the left side of her face to catch some of the crimson liquid flowing freely out of the eye socket, while her thumb and index finger held the eyeball by its trailing optic nerve, dangling it in front of her like a piece of jewelry. He stood in stunned silence. His mouth moved, but he couldn't find any words to articulate. The girl laughed at him, a childish laugh this time that seemed completely out of place. She put her head down and brought her left hand to her face. When she looked up again, her face was whole and bloodless, and her smiling expression had returned to one of youthful impishness. If you really want your body back, Chan, I'll give you a chance. Let's play a game for it. Convince me that your life has meaning, and I'll give it back. If you can't, you stay here and play with me forever until you go away. Convince you? How? He asked uncertainly, forcing his mind to work through the shock of the scene he'd just witnessed. It's easy. Tell me what the purpose of your life is. Show me that there's a point to letting you go on. The purpose of my life? He paused to think for a second before continuing. It's to become the greatest Hokage ever. Don't lie to me, Chan, she admonished with a wagging finger. I've been in your mind as long as you've been alive. You can't hide things from me. He growled in annoyance. Then why don't you tell me what the purpose of my life is? She giggled at his angry tone. How could I tell you when you don't even know in your heart? Her words brought him up short. A week ago he could have immediately given her an answer he was certain of in his mind, though he had a feeling it wasn't one she would have accepted. Now he wasn't even sure himself. How could he give her an answer he didn't have? If you're unhappy with the answer that you've been given, you'll have to find one that works for you and stick to it. His sensei had said that. That was what he had to do now, find his own answer. And he had to do it before he died. Or became more dead. He wasn't sure how that worked, but didn't really have time to figure it out. The purpose of my life is to become the strongest ninja I can be, he tried. Why? What do you mean why? It's the purpose of every ninja, to get as strong as he can be, so he can be useful to his village. That's why you have to put me back. What do I care about what you have to do, as a ninja? It doesn't matter whether you're strong or not. In the end you still die. It doesn't matter whether I die or not. What matters is that I served my village to the best of my ability. He knew she would reject this before he finished. Even as he said the words, they rang hollow in his own mind. If you're not there to serve your village, someone else will be. So what's the point of your existence? She took a few exaggerated steps, hands behind her back, and face contorted into a childlike imitation of deep thought, before turning to him again. Besides, you don't even care about the village. I know the things you were thinking when you grew up. You may be fighting for your village, but you're not fighting for it, are you? He opened his mouth to respond, but couldn't find the words. She was right. He had never really thought through why he wanted to be where he was. When he was a child, he had seen how much respect the Hokage garnered in the village and decided he wanted people to treat him like that as well. When that childish fantasy had been taken from him, he kept on the path to becoming a shinobi of the leaf because it was the only one he could see before him. But while he didn't care about the village as a whole, there were individuals who held meaning for him. Fine, maybe I'm not fighting for the village as a whole. But there are people in the village who are important to me, those I would be willing to fight and die for. I was fighting for my important people when you brought me here. Put me back so I can protect them. "Remember your own words," she said, looking up at the roof of the cavern with one finger to her cheek, as if trying to remember something. "I'll do whatever I can to protect them, but ultimately they're ready to lay down their lives for the sake of the mission, as well." He gritted his teeth in frustration. It was like she knew him better than he did himself. The words she used mirrored and articulated the discord that had been brewing in his thoughts for the last week, ever since he met that girl. "Time's running short, Chan," she reminded him, while balancing herself on one leg, her arms extended on either side for balance. "Even if I wanted to, I can't keep you here forever." He closed his eyes, trying to think of something that could justify his existence. One after another the words came, floating to the top of his mind, as if they had been lying just beneath the surface the whole time, waiting for the right moment. "I have to get stronger. I have to fight so I can protect the dreams of those who are important to me." Their dreams? Unbidden, a series of images flashed through his mind. When he was 6, he twisted his ankle badly. Gigi had been there for him, hugging him in the hospital, telling him not to cry. They had spent the rest of the day on top of the Hokage monument, looking over the village that the old man cherished, talking about childish things, as if they were the most important topics in the world. Then his first bowl of ramen smiled at him as he took his first bite. When he screwed up the tree walking exercise, after getting almost to the top, Kurenai had rushed over to him right away. He remembered the worried look in her eyes as she checked him over for injuries before scolding him about being not careful enough. Shino, standing to one side quietly talking to his bugs. How he could give meaning to the smallest gesture or expression, a secret language that only those who knew the reserved boy well could interpret. Sakura, sitting on the log that first day, declaring her little girl's fantasy of a dream with all the adult earnestness her body could muster. The girl with the strange name. Haku. Her dream of a peaceful life with lots of friends. A dream she had shared with him. "That's an interesting answer, Chan." She was standing before him again, head cocked to one side with a smile on her face. "Yes. I have people that are important to me," he replied with more firmness than he'd felt the entire conversation. "It's not enough that I protect them. I have to make sure they're happy too." She clapped her hands together with a delighted expression on her face. "I like that answer. It makes you sound like a fairy tale prince." "So you're going to give me back my body?" he said haltingly, trying to disguise the rising hope he felt. "Yup, I liked your answer so much I'll even give you a going away present," but now she reached her arms out to him. After a moment's hesitation, he obliged. Kneeling before her, he reached and embraced her in a hug. She wrapped her own small arms around him, laying her chin on his left shoulder and pressing her lips close to his ear to whisper. "I had fun today, Chan. We should play this game again sometime. But before you go, there's one thing you need to know. You're going to see him again, and when you do, you can't hesitate. You have to trust me and accept everything I give you, because if you don't, you'll." The darkness fell over him once again. Power. He awoke to the sensation of infinite power, as if every single cell in his body were overflowing with chakra. He had never felt so strong, so alive before. His muscles ached with the desire to rend flesh and shatter bone. There was a crunching sound, the feeling of something brittle smashing against his fist. He narrowed his eyes, looking through the white haze that whirled wildly around him. There was an arm holding a body up by the neck. Another arm had just smashed its fist into the body's face. He looked more closely and recognized that they were his arms. He was holding a body up, and he had just punched it in the face. The free arm drew back, as if by its own volition, readying itself for another strike. He examined the body held by his other arm. It wore bulky clothing. Its face was framed by long black hair and covered in a porcelain mask. One of its hands hung limply over the arm holding it up, while the other was weakly prying at the fingers around its neck. There was something familiar about the body, but he couldn't remember what. His muscles begged for release. The tension in his cocked arm was tight as steel wire. He allowed it to go. Cracked from top to bottom, the mask fell away. He stared at the mask's owner, and a pair of wide-brown eyes stared back at him, set in a face that was a perfect picture of fear and panic. His eyes widened to match. He realized with a start that he recognized this person. Images and sounds flashed through his mind. "Oh, by the way, I'm a girl. Is that why you fight? Because you're supposed to?" He felt his fist hurtling through the air. He wanted to stop it. There was some reason he didn't want to hit this person. A small gaunt voice in the back of his mind screamed for him to let go, to tear the body apart and smash it until there was nothing left. I want to settle in a peaceful place, free from trouble, conflict, and suffering, and make lots of friends." His entire body stiffened into immobility as he took control. His fist froze a hair's breadth away from her. Suddenly, Naruto felt more tired than he ever had before. The swirling white haze that filled his vision had disappeared, and his muscles felt as if he'd just gone through his most brutal daily training routines twice in a row without pause. The muscles in his arm burned from the exertion of holding the hunter nin up, reminding him of his present situation. He released his grip on her neck, allowing her to drop down to her feet even as his exhausted arm fell lifelessly to his side. She took several shaky steps backwards before falling down, watery brown eyes focused on him the entire time. The last of his strength left him. His legs gave out, and he slumped down to the ground heavily. He sat there, staring back at her with a blank face, too tired to get up or even pull the muscles in his face into some kind of expression. Kurenai let out a small breath and allowed some of the tension in her body to dissipate as the white aura left Naruto. The blonde was sitting on the far end of the bridge and appeared completely exhausted. He didn't seem to be in any shape to fight, but Zetsubou's hunter nin partner looked to be just as much out of it. She saw with relief that Shino was alive as well and had moved a small distance away from Naruto and the hunter nin when the white chakra flared up. Across the bridge from her, Zetsubou had not moved from the defensive posture he adopted when they first saw the white chakra flaring. "What was that?" asked the mist swordsman, his gaze alternating between Kurenai and the two at the end of the bridge. "I don't know," she replied. It was an easy enough lie to pass off, as she didn't know the details of the situation herself. It was possible that it hadn't been the Kyuubi at all. Instead, Naruto had just manifested some unknown Kekkei Genkai or ability. The other alternative was that it had been the Kyuubi, and Naruto somehow managed to suppress it. Whichever turned out to be the right answer, Kurenai was just glad that both her students had come out of the fight with the hunter nin and the subsequent chakra flare-up without any visible serious injuries. "That chakra wasn't natural," Zetsubou muttered, as much to himself as to Kurenai. "I haven't felt something like that in years." "He's one of them, isn't he?" "Them?" Kurenai asked, eyes narrowing. "The Jinchuriki. The last time I felt an aura like that was the Sanbi's container. Everyone's heard stories about the demon attacking Konoha 12 years ago. They say that the 4th Hokage destroyed it at the cost of his own life, but is this how you really dealt with it?" Kurenai didn't respond to the question. If she didn't want to reinforce Zetsubou's suspicions, it was best to refrain from replying, allowing doubts to gnaw away at his thoughts instead. Any sort of response would simply give him more information to work with. She could exploit his suspicions without reinforcing them though. "I have no interest in collecting your bounty," Kurenai said in an even tone. "Our mission is simply to protect Izuna-san until the bridge is complete. The balance of power has changed. We've fought each other to a draw, but now your partner has been defeated and my students will soon have recovered enough to fight again. Remember how things turned out when you took on all of us together. The smart thing to do would be to take your partner and withdraw." Driving Zetsubou away was the best strategic option, all things considered. Trying to win the fight now carried the risk of serious injury or death for her genin, and every day she could postpone a decisive showdown with the Mist Swordsman, and his partner was another day for reinforcements from Konoha to arrive. Zetsubou replied with a harsh guttural laugh. "Don't look down on me just because I'm a missing nin. Even we have our own sort of pride. My loyalty may be to my client and not my home village now, but I will not abandon a mission just because things are starting to look difficult." A new voice cut through their conversation. "Hahaha. That's the kind of thing I like to hear, even from a worthless dog like you, Zetsubou. Demon of the Mist indeed, you can't even handle an old man and some children." Both elite jounin turned their attention to the new arrivals. Standing on the far end of the bridge was a short man in a black business suit, smiling arrogantly like he owned the world. His right arm was in a sling, while his left held an expensive-looking silver-knobbed cane. Behind him were around 50 people. Most were armed with various pole weapons, but a few carried bows or katana instead. "This is perfect though," the businessman declared with a wave of his left arm. "Now that you and Tizuna's ninja have exhausted each other fighting, I can kill you all and save myself the expense of having to pay a missing nin." "What are you talking about? We had a deal, and I still intend to complete the mission," Zetsubou said, his posture and attention now turned fully towards the businessman and his thugs. "You're a greater fool than I thought, Zetsubou," the businessman retorted. "I never intended to pay you. And now you've given me the perfect opportunity to clean up this entire mess in one stroke. Do you seriously think I will allow you to leave this place with your head for betraying me? Your numbers mean nothing to me, Zetsubou growled dangerously. The businessman laughed. Look at you, talking big like that when you've worn yourself out fighting. Maybe when you're dead I'll take that pretty little thing of yours and keep her drugged and chained up for what she did to my arm. Kurenai frowned slightly. The situation was rapidly spinning out of control. By the way he talked and acted, the businessman was undoubtedly Gatu. The group of henchmen standing behind him was sizable in number, but looked to be mostly untrained thugs with a few trained fighters mixed in. They really weren't a threat for an elite jounin of her or Zetsubou's caliber even at half strength, but the missed swordsman's reaction was the wild card that complicated everything. If Gatu's thugs started to attack, she could move fast enough to protect Shino and probably Naruto as well. But doing so would expose her back to Zetsubou and also leave Sakura and Tazuna at the other end of the bridge vulnerable. Crimson eyes, our fight is over. At roost for now? Zetsubou suggested, quietly enough, that his voice wouldn't carry to the far end of the bridge. She gave him the slightest of nods and then subtly turned her body so that she could react more immediately to anything Gatu or his thugs did. Forget it, mumbled Gatu, before resuming in a louder voice, go. Kill them all. Naruto was so physically and mentally tired that it threatened to overwhelm him, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself to focus on the scene unfolding before him. He knew that he was in a bad situation. He had no idea what happened to his sword, and in his current state he'd be lucky to take down more than one or two of the thugs with taijutsu, let alone the 50 or so the short businessman had behind him. He knew Shino was somewhere behind him and his sensei further back along the bridge, but he didn't dare turn his eyes away from the businessman and his thugs to find out how far away they were. The girl he had met in the forest was between him and the group of thugs, but she looked like she was in worse shape than he felt. He tried to remember what her name was. He remembered calling her by name during their conversation in the forest, but, as exhausted as his mind was, he could only draw a blank from his still shaky memories. The only bright spot in the whole mess was that the businessman wasn't there to reinforce her and the guy with the giant sword. For now at least, the two groups of ninja were allies of convenience. Then the businessman gave the girl an evil leer while saying something that Naruto guessed was referring to her. It took a moment for the blonde to understand why he bristled at that. Her words had brought him back when everything he once accepted had failed him. Her beliefs had been accepted by the strange girl in his dreams when even he recognized how empty and hollow he sounded. Naruto wasn't sure whether that meant she had saved his life, but he knew that he owed her a lot. Then the short businessman gave an order. Several of the thugs armed with bows knocked arrows and began to draw. She wasn't moving. She was staring at them with a wide-eyed expression, too shocked by the events of the last few minutes to react. He had to help her, he owed it to her. He was the only one who could reach her in time. His body was in motion before his mind could rationally comprehend what he was about to do. Haku watched, transfixed, as the boy who had been trying to kill her only minutes before threw himself in front of her. Her mind vaguely registered the sound of 3 dull thumps from somewhere ahead. For a moment, there was silence and stillness. For a moment, the boy stood between them and her. She couldn't understand why he was smiling at her. The boy's knees buckled. At first, she thought he was drifting backwards. She watched as the smile faded from the boy's face as the light seemed to go out of his eyes. Then his head lolled forward like a broken doll and his body followed. Haku watched, wide-eyed, as the boy slumped to the ground face down like a marionette with its strings cut. For a moment, her world returned to silence. And then there was pandemonium. Kurenai was in motion as soon as the first arrow flew, speeding along one side of the bridge and passing Naruto by in a blur. She knew without looking that Zetsubou was doing the same on the other side. For now, they were allies. She ruthlessly suppressed the part of her that wanted to go to her student. There was time later for worrying. Or for mourning. At that moment, she was a shinobi of the leaf. There was a threat before her and people to protect behind her. She had a job to do. Kurenai threw herself into Gatu's army, fists and steel and fury, accompanied by a wide area that crippled most of them with fear. Across from her, Zetsubou tore through their ranks with broad swipes of his giant sword. They never stood a chance. Bandits, ex-samurai, runaway genin who couldn't make it as proper missing nin. Some turned to run and were cut down in their tracks. A few raised their weapons to defend themselves and were dispatched with nearly equal ease. Most died where they stood, paralyzed by the twin specters of inevitable doom hurtling toward them. The sound of clashing steel and dying screams brought Haku's mind crashing back to reality. The intensity of the carnage ahead frightened even her, accustomed, as she was to death from traveling with Zetsubou. There was nothing she could do there. She looked down, eyes focusing on the still form before her. 3 arrows stuck out of his back at odd angles. A small pool of crimson was gathering beneath him. The boy had taken those arrows for her and was now bleeding all over the bridge because of her. She had to do something. Haku scrambled on hands and knees over to him, ignoring the stabs of pain every time she put weight on her injured arm. Putting a trembling hand against his neck, she was relieved to find a weak pulse. He was still alive. She closed her eyes and took 3 deep breaths, trying to slow her racing heart, trying to stop her hands from trembling. Pulling a thin knife from her sleeve, she then set herself to carefully cutting the arrows out of the boy's back, trying to do as little damage as possible. Once the arrows were removed, she tried to summon the familiar green aura into her hands, the way she had seen her mother do so long ago. She wasn't skilled enough to heal wounds like her mother had been able to, but trying something was still better than helplessly watching him bleed for her. Green chakra burst from her hands in a wild and erratic dance, reflecting the confusion and turmoil in her mind. Closing her eyes, she breathed deeply again, forcing her breath to steady and her heartbeat to slow, doing her best to ignore the chaos around her. When she felt her chakra flow steady, she opened her eyes and began to push a constant stream of chakra into the boy's back through her hands. "Please, don't die on me, Naruto." They reached the fleeing form of Gato at nearly the same time, her kunai piercing his lower back and severing the spinal cord just as his oversized sword flashed through the space his neck occupied to separate head from body. Kurenai turned to look at the trail of carnage they had left in their wake. Between Zetsubou and herself, all of Gato's henchmen had been dispatched in the space of a few minutes. On her side of the bridge, the thugs looked like they had simply fallen asleep, brought down as they were by precise taijutsu and kunai strikes. In contrast, Zetsubou's side looked more like a slaughterhouse, with blood splattered all over the bridge and most of the bodies in pieces. She gave the mist swordsman a questioning look. Now that their common enemy had been dealt with, the situation between them was uncertain again. "The truce stands, unless you wish to continue," Zetsubou grunted. "My employer's dead, I no longer have a reason to take the bridge builder's head." Kurenai nodded. "Fine. Now would be a good time to check on our people." The 2 elite jounin moved back along the bridge, each keeping to one side to give the other a comfortable distance. Although there was no longer a reason to fight, it was a rare shinobi who reached their level of rank and experience without having developed a healthy, almost paranoid sense of caution. Kurenai breathed a sigh of relief when she saw the hunter nin hunched over Naruto's prone form, her hands pressing on his back and surrounded by a pale green aura. That meant her student wasn't dead, or at least not yet. Further along the bridge, Shino had retreated to regroup with Sakura and Tazuna. She gave them a hand sign to keep their position before moving closer to check on Naruto. Zetsubou spoke first as the 2 elite jounin stopped a few paces from the focus of their attention. "How is he?" Fully immersed in controlling the flow of her chakra, Haku hadn't noticed Zetsubou and Kurenai approaching. She looked up in surprise, the green aura around her hands wavering as her concentration broke. She took a few seconds to regain her focus, bringing her chakra flow back under control before responding in a quiet voice. "He took 3 arrows to the back. I can stop the bleeding and stabilize him for now, but he really needs to be taken to a doctor. There's probably been some organ damage." Kurenai frowned at the girl's words. The best that the town could offer were folk herbal healers, nothing like the fully trained and equipped medical professionals that Naruto's situation seemed to call for. The alternative was to hire a carriage and hurry Naruto back to Konoha. Even if she could arrange for a carriage and a ferry to take it to the mainland on short notice, the journey would still take most of a day. Going that route would also mean abandoning the missions, as the terms were to protect Azuna until the bridge was finished. Zetsubou's voice cut into her thoughts. "Haku, go with them." The green aura wavered again. Haku quickly stopped the flow of chakra to her hands before looking up. "Zetsubou-san? The boy saved your life. Stay with them tonight and do what you can for him." But she stammered uncertainty. "Do it," Zetsubou commanded, his voice taking on a slightly harsher tone. "Follow their instructions, as you would mine." "Yes, Zetsubou-san." Zetsubou turned to Kurenai. "Crimson Eyes, I give you my word, as one of the 7 swordsmen, that she will not harm you or your people." Will you allow her to accompany you back to the bridge builder's home? Kurenai considered the situation for a few seconds before nodding in reply. She needed all the help she could get with Naruto at this point. Shaosen Jutsu was a basic medical ninjutsu skill, but it was still far better than the kind of medical care she could get for Naruto in town. The girl would be useful in keeping Naruto stable until they could start the trip back to Konoha. Furthermore, Zabuza was unusual amongst missing nin in that he had a reputation for professional integrity. He was able to command a premium for his services because he was always true to his word and never abandoned a mission. Unless, she supposed, his employer betrayed him and tried to have him killed to avoid having to pay his fee. But she could hardly hold that against the man. Satisfied with Kurenai's response, Zabuza brought his hands together in a seal and disappeared off the bridge in a shunshin. Kurenai signaled for the rest of her team to gather on her before kneeling by the raven-haired girl. Is it safe to move him? Give me a few minutes, Haku replied without looking up, her hands already returning to Naruto's back. I've almost got the bleeding stopped. Sensei? Sakura asked as she approached, warily eyeing the raven-haired girl the whole while. Haku's healing Naruto's injuries. She'll be staying with us tonight, if that's okay with you, Tazuna-san? Kurenai replied. Sure, of course, if you think it's alright, Kurenai-san, Tazuna said in answer to her question. But what about Zabuza? Zabuza gave me his word that she won't attack us and we could use her skill with medical ninjutsu right now. With Gatu dead now, there's no longer a reason for Zabuza to target you. I feel that in this situation we can believe what he says. Kurenai didn't mention that she intended to keep a close watch on Haku regardless. By that time Sakura had approached close enough to see Naruto's wounds and the pink-haired girl's eyes bugged out at the sight. Is Naruto going to be okay? Kurenai noticed that Haku's head dropped slightly at the question, as if the girl felt responsible for Naruto's condition. Mentally filing that information away for later, she turned to answer her student. He's not going to die, but we need to get him back to Konoha so he can get proper medical treatment. Haku will do what she can to keep him stable overnight, and then I'll arrange for transportation to take him back tomorrow. She then turned to her other student. How badly have you hurt Shino? I took a number of wounds. She wasn't aiming to kill though, and none of my injuries are life-threatening. Sakura should be able to patch me up with her first aid training. Kurenai nodded. She had become familiar with Shino's calculated manner of speaking after working with the bug user for weeks. His deliberately crafted response was meant to reassure Sakura and Tazuna about Haku, and also to indicate that Haku's healing capabilities should be focused entirely on his far more seriously wounded teammate. Okay then. Haku, please get Naruto to the point where we can move him. Sakura, please look after Shino. Tazuna-san, I'd like you to get something to make a stretcher with so we can carry Naruto back to your place. It was approaching evening by the time the group returned to Tazuna's house. They were met by a relieved Tsunami who filled them in on how Naruto had dealt with the two ex-samurai before leaving. Once she saw the blonde on the stretcher, she immediately prepared the best room in the house for him to stay in. As Tazuna often traveled for work, the best room in the house turned out to be Tsunami's own room. Kurenai asked for a second bed to be brought into the room as well. Haku had resumed applying healing chakra to Naruto as soon the blonde had been laid down in bed, and the red-eyed Jounin could see that the girl was approaching chakra exhaustion. Once the second bed was set up, she ordered the raven-haired girl to rest. It was a sign of just how emotionally draining the events of the day had been for her that Haku complied meekly with the order, and she was asleep and snoring lightly as soon as her head hit the pillow. Kurenai had to admit that she was impressed by the girl's abilities. She looked to be only a year or two older than her own students, an age when most genin started considering the possibility of taking the Chunin examination. Given how long she had kept up the Shaosen Jutsu after using her Kekkei Genkai to fight first Shino and then Naruto, though, her chakra reserves were easily Chunin level. Her ability to use the medical ninjutsu technique also spoke of her high level of chakra control. On the other hand, though she was just a bit shorter than Shino, she had a surprisingly slender flame for a kunoichi. Her build made her unsuited to taijutsu combat, and Kurenai recalled how Shino had the upper hand during the bridge fight until Haku had used her ice mirror technique. Zabuza had most likely come to the same conclusion and trained her as a ranged specialist to support his own close combat prowess. Once she was sure that the raven-haired girl was deeply asleep and wouldn't wake up for some time, she left the room to find her other students. Shino, Sakura, I need to talk to the two of you for a minute. The two of them dutifully followed their sensei back to Naruto and Haku's room. Kurenai closed the door securely and then waited for the two to seat themselves before speaking in a quiet voice. "We can fully debrief once we're back in Konoha, but for now I'd like to get a quick summary of what happened during the bridge fight." She turned to Shino first. He was the closest of her students and, aside from Haku, had the best view of what happened. The bug user nodded and began recounting his view of the day's events. "I began by engaging Haku in a taijutsu fight. With the aid of coordinated attacks from my bug clone, I was able to put her on the defensive. Then she unveiled her ice-based Kekkei Genkai abilities. She trapped me with a dome of 21 mirrors of ice. She was able to project her image onto all of them and attack seemingly any of them at any time. I quickly determined that she was aiming to reduce my mobility and response time with bleeding wounds and nerve strikes in order to remove me from the fight without killing me." Shino raised one hand to adjust his sunglasses before continuing. "Through experimentation, I was able to deduce that she was hiding in one mirror at a time, using the other false images as camouflage. She was able to move from one mirror to another at very high speeds, giving the appearance of attacking from all directions at once. I was unable to defeat her technique, however. My bug allies were unwilling to touch the ice directly because of the cold. Explosive tags did not appear to have any effect on the mirrors, and I lacked the speed necessary to intercept and physically engage her while she was traveling between mirrors. That was when Naruto arrived. I did not see how he managed to penetrate the ice mirror dome, but my guess is some sort of custom explosive tag larger than standard size. I relayed my findings about Haku's abilities and told him of my reduced combat capability. He suggested that I pretend to be unconscious until I was sufficiently recovered to rejoin the fight. I did, as Naruto said, though I kept an eye open to observe the fight." Shino readjusted his glasses again. Kurenai picked up on this, taking it as a sign that the boy was approaching a part of the narrative that he felt some uncertainty over. At first, Naruto was also unable to physically engage her in the time she spent outside the mirrors while she employed the same non-lethal tactic with him. Then he raised his hitayat to reveal a red eye that had been hidden underneath. Sakura's eyes widened and she looked like she was about to say something. Kurenai cut her off with a raised hand to indicate that she should hold her questions for the moment before nodding at Shino to continue. I came to the conclusion that the eye gave Naruto increased visual acuity as he was suddenly able to defend himself from Haku's attacks with much greater success and almost managed to strike her between mirrors. She came to the same conclusion as well and asked Naruto about the eye during an interlude. He did not elaborate on the eye's abilities but did say that he wasn't well liked in Konoha and that if anyone knew about his eye his situation would be worse. Once more Shino paused to readjust his sunglasses. Naruto finally adopted an unusual stance. I did not recognize its purpose at the time, but on reflection I think he was deliberately exposing an angle of attack to Haku in order to lure her to a predictable course of action. She took his bait, and this time Naruto was able to connect with a solid strike. During the ensuing exchange though, she was able to close in and land a kick against his ribs on the injured side. I could see that Naruto had suffered a serious injury. He was spitting up blood and wheezing in a way that sounded like he couldn't breathe. I ran over to him to see what I could do to help. That's when I felt the first flare of chakra from Naruto. It grew until it shattered Haku's ice dome, and when I looked again I saw that Naruto was surrounded by a visible aura of white chakra. I moved away so as to not get caught in whatever was happening. Shino paused to take a breath. Kurenai noticed that he was visibly uncomfortable now. For the bug user, this was quite a change from his normally tight control over emotional displays. Naruto stood up again, and I saw, as he did, that his injuries from the fight were healing themselves right before my eyes. He grabbed Haku by the neck and began striking her. When her Hunter Nin mask cracked and fell apart though, it seemed like he recognized her. He stopped mid-punch and let her go, and that's when Gatu and his men arrived. Kurenai nodded and then turned to her other student. "Sakura? I don't really have anything to add, sensei. I was too far away." Something about the tone of Sakura's reply bothered her, but Kurenai set that thought aside for now. "I want the two of you to listen to me carefully. I'm not sure what happened with Naruto. It's something I need to discuss with Hokage-sama when we return to Konoha. In the meanwhile, I need you two to consider all details about Naruto's involvement in the fight, an S-class secret. I do not want anything about the white chakra or Naruto having a hidden red eye getting out when we return to Konoha." You both know what the potential penalties are for divulging S-class secrets. Is that clear? Shino gave her a quick nod, while Sakura's was slower and more hesitant. Good, Kurenai continued in a more relaxed tone. Now let's get something to eat and get some rest. We have a hard journey ahead of us tomorrow. It was near midnight when Kurenai first felt the odd sensation. She had been sleeping on a chair in Naruto and Haku's room, but her finely honed instincts brought her to full wakefulness within seconds. It took her a few more seconds to identify it. Skilled shinobi often developed a certain feeling of presence, most commonly expressed as a killing intent, which allowed them to cow civilians and weaker enemies through sheer force of willpower and personality alone. What she was feeling now was Zetsubou's presence, with enough of it released to catch her attention, but also deliberately suppressed to a level that neither Tezuna's family nor her genin could feel with their less developed senses. She quickly checked on Naruto and Haku to make sure that the former was still stable and the latter still asleep, and then made her way out of Tezuna's house towards the forest in the back, where she felt his presence most strongly. She took a few steps beyond the tree line before stopping. "Your hunter nin's asleep," Kurenai said to what seemed to be an ordinary section of forest. She was pretty close to chakra exhaustion. Zetsubou dropped out of a tree ahead of her and landed on one knee. She noted that he was maintaining a distance, which indicated he most likely hadn't come for a violent confrontation. Hanging over his right shoulder was a large traveling pack, though Kurenai thought that the powder blue bedroll strapped to the pack's top was an odd color choice for the demon of the mist. He stood up, shrugging the pack off and letting it fall to the ground as he did so. "It might be best this way," Zetsubou said. Kurenai cocked her head to one side, waiting for him to explain further. "I'm asking a favor of you," he grunted. "This is everything Haku owns. I want you to take her back to Konoha with you. If your Hokage will allow it, she would make a useful addition to your ranks." A few seconds passed in silence before Kurenai replied. "Why?" she asked simply. "Konoha is well known for its love of bloodlines. You've seen how powerful hers can be, and, as far as I know, she's the last of her line. I found and trained her myself. There's no record of her as a shinobi of Kiri, so there shouldn't be any political problems. Trust issues aside, I don't see why Konoha wouldn't accept her." Kurenai considered Zetsubou's words. Acquiring a bloodline as potent as Haku's would be a major coup for Konoha. Especially if no other hidden villages had access to it. Even if she refused to serve Leaf, or if the Hokage deemed her too questionable to use as a shinobi, there was still value to keeping her confined in Konoha so that potentially hostile powers wouldn't have access to her abilities. There was also the fact that Haku had been closest when Naruto's chakra flared. To keep the secret of the Kyuubi from potentially getting outside Konoha, it was best to take the girl back. As for motive, it was possible that Zetsubou was trying to plant an agent in Konoha. Kurenai didn't see how that would substantially benefit his position as a missing nin though. The loyalty question was more about Ibiki's department anyway. From her point of view, there was no downside to taking Haku back to Konoha regardless of the girl's ultimate loyalties or usefulness. She suspected that Zetsubou's reasons for asking this favor were most likely personal rather than strategic. With someone of his personality though, she doubted that she would be able to get him to acknowledge something like that. Still, it never hurts to try. "I'm more interested in why you want to leave her behind." Zetsubou shrugged. "Maybe I feel a fatherly affection for her and want her to have a chance at a stable life instead of always being on the run with me. Maybe her usefulness as my tool ended when she lost a fight and then decided to risk her life healing a potential enemy without my orders. Maybe it's a combination of the two. Does it really matter?" "I suppose not," Kurenai conceded. She hadn't expected to get much more out of the Mist Swordsman. "So will you take her? What if she refuses to go? Ask her about the first lesson I taught her and then tell her that she has fulfilled hers for me." "Fulfilled what?" Kurenai asked. "It doesn't matter, just use those words. She will do as you tell her to." "Fine, I'll take her back with my team to Konoha. Whatever happens beyond that is up to Hokage-sama." "Good. Your client is safe now. I've dealt with the few henchmen Gato didn't bring to the bridge with him, and I intend to be out of this rat hole of a country in 2 hours." "Dealt with them? Wave Country won't have problems anymore. At least not from Gato's organization." "That was very benevolent of you," Kurenai commented. Zetsubou laughed. The hard, gravely edge of his voice reminded Kurenai of just how dangerous a predator the demon of the mist was. "Benevolence has nothing to do with it. Since Gatu's no longer around, I took my payment from his office and the corpses of the men he employed. Besides, I really don't want to have any of Gatu's henchmen running around trying to take revenge on me for their boss. It would get annoying." Zabuza turned and began walking away, but stopped after several steps for a few last words. "It was an interesting experience taking on you and your students' crimson eyes. I hope we never meet again." Kurenai waited until she could no longer sense Zabuza's presence before moving to examine the contents of the pack. She found several sets of clothing, a storage scroll, some kunai, and an envelope with a small stack of paper currency tucked into a side pocket. She gave some thought to taking away the weaponry and storage scroll as a precaution, but in the end decided against doing so. It was a calculated risk, not stripping Haku of weapons or securing her as a prisoner. But leaving the weapons and scroll in place was a sign of good faith that Kurenai could use to build a rapprochement with. Even if Haku decided to get hostile, Kurenai was sure that she could subdue the girl without allowing harm to come to her students. Consciousness returned slowly to Naruto, accompanied by ever stronger throbs of pain that seemed to come from all over his body. He opened his eyes and slowly glanced around, trying to move his neck as little as possible because of the pain. The sight that greeted him was the faint outlines of a ceiling and walls, palely illuminated by the moon's light filtered through the thin curtain of a single large window. He couldn't identify the room, but recognized the style of the ceiling boards and wall paneling. He was back in Tezuna's house, so he must have survived the bridge fight. But why was he in such pain? Had he done something stupid? He couldn't help but grimace as the memories flowed into his consciousness. He had jumped in front of arrows to protect someone who had been an enemy only a few minutes before. That definitely counted as stupid, and he could just imagine Kurenai-sensei scolding him about it now. As he replayed the events in his mind though, he realized he didn't regret his actions. Even now he felt it was the right thing to do, and he had come through it alive. There was a detail about the fight that bothered Naruto though. He was sure that Haku had broken his ribs during the fight, but there wasn't any sign of that now. Slowly, carefully, Naruto brought his left hand up to move along his ribs, pressing in against bone every so often. There was pain, but it was all coming from his back. There was nothing unusual about his ribs aside from the fact that they weren't hurt at all. Even if he had been wrong about Haku kicking him in the ribs, there should still be pain from when Zabuza cracked them a week ago. His mind went back to the conversation with the girl in his mind. She, whatever she was, had said something about fixing his body. She also said that she gave him a going-away present. The first time he met her she had said the same thing, and he had come out of it with an unnatural red eye. Was it possible that the present this time had to do with healing? Naruto closed his eyes, focusing on his back and visualizing the healing in his mind. At first there was nothing, and he felt a little foolish for thinking that he could heal himself by concentrating. A few seconds later, he felt a feeling of warmth spreading across his back. The sensation quickly built until he felt uncomfortably hot. The blonde tried to prop himself up on his arms to get some airflow across his back, but he only made it partway up before his strength gave out and he collapsed back onto the bed. By that time his back felt like it was lying in a pool of lava. He writhed around the bed helplessly. Nothing he tried seemed to reduce the agonizing heat he felt. A blood-curdling scream ripped its way out of his throat. For the second time that night Kurenai found herself unexpectedly waking from her slumber. Even before she was fully awake, her mind had registered Naruto's pained scream. She rolled out of the chair she had been sleeping in into a defensive crouch, eyes quickly scanning around the room. She saw that Naruto was still in his bed and was panting heavily. Across the room Haku was sitting up in bed with sheets pulled to her chest, her bleary eyes showing that she had just woken as well. Once Kurenai was sure that there was no immediate external threat she quickly moved to her student. "Naruto? What's wrong?" His eyelids snapped open, red and blue eyes turning to meet hers. "My back, there's something," felt like burning. She put her hands under his shoulders and gently lifted him up into a sitting position and then moved behind him to inspect his wounds. Just then the door burst open. Thinking quickly, Kurenai grabbed Naruto's aid off the nightstand and pulled it down over his head to cover his left eye. She then looked up to see Shino's large frame outlined against a doorway with a hint of pink hair just visible to one side. Judging from the sound of multiple footsteps though, Tezuna and Tsunami weren't far behind. Seeing that Naruto didn't appear to be in any immediate danger, Kurenai made a quick decision. "Sakura, tell them there's nothing wrong and go back to bed." Tell them it was a nightmare or something. Say what you need to keep them from coming in here." Kurenai didn't know what had happened with Naruto, but there was the possibility of it being related to his tenant. With everything that had happened so far concerning the blonde, she felt that it was best if the information was kept to as few people as possible. She couldn't keep the rest of the team out without increasing their suspicion, and Haku was already too deeply involved, but there was no reason to bring Tazuna or Tsunami into the equation. She had chosen Sakura because, of her 3 students, the pink-haired girl had the best diplomatic skills and stood the best chance of heading the bridge builder and his daughter off without raising their suspicions. Kurenai turned back to Naruto and began carefully cutting away the bandages wrapped around his chest. By the time she was nearly finished, her other students and Haku had gathered around his bed to watch, concerned over the blonde temporarily overriding any sense of distrust from having been recent enemies. When Kurenai gently peeled the last bloody section of bandage from Naruto's back, only her skill, as a shinobi, kept her from displaying any visible shock at the sight that greeted her. She could hear the girl's breaths hitching, and even Shino gave a small grunt of surprise. There was blood all over Naruto's back, but beneath it there was no sign of the injuries he had sustained during the bridge fight. She put 2 fingers to his back and cautiously felt around the places where she remembered the arrow wounds to be. When she pressed her fingers in, she felt nothing but intact flesh and undamaged bone. "Sensei?" Naruto asked in a wavering voice, even as he tried to turn and look at what she was doing. "How do you feel now?" Kurenai asked in return. "Tired. Really tired, like I used a lot of chakra, but I don't feel hurt anymore." Kurenai turned to the raven-haired girl standing with her team. "Haku, can you come and check on Naruto?" Haku nodded and moved behind the blonde. Her thin fingers moved around Naruto's back the way Kurenai's had, gently prodding and looking for any hints of injury. She then brought a bit of chakra to her palms, lighting them up with a pale green aura, and pressed them against his back. Finally, Haku pulled her hands away and leaned back with a confused expression. "There's nothing. There's no sign of tissue damage, and the chakra flow is normal. It's like he never got hurt." Kurenai gave the situation some thought. Naruto seemed physically fine, so she could use this as an opportunity to get his version of what happened during the bridge fight without having to include the others. For the moment, she deferred questions of just how Naruto had healed himself. It was more than likely due to his tenant, and that was something she preferred to discuss with him in private as well. "Okay, well, Naruto, let's get you cleaned up first. The 3 of you please stay here. We can talk once Naruto's done." Kurenai put her arms around Naruto and helped him to his feet and then led him through the door into the bedroom's adjoining bathroom. She deposited him in the bathtub and drew the shower curtain closed, waiting for the sound of running water to begin before speaking in a quiet voice. "Naruto, there are some things we need to talk about. But first tell me why you protected Haku." For a few seconds Naruto didn't speak, and she started wondering if he hadn't heard her over the sound of the water. Then his reply came in a subdued tone. His narrative was disjointed and meandering, as if he was trying to put the pieces together in his own head while speaking. He began with his arrival on the bridge, breaching the ice mirror with an experimental tag, and the ensuing fight. She winced sympathetically when he described how he felt after Haku had kicked him in the ribs. Naruto paused for a few seconds, and when he resumed the narrative had jumped back several days. He described his first meeting with the raven-haired girl and repeated the words she said at the time. Kurenai briefly considered whether or not to admonish him for not bringing that encounter to her attention earlier, no matter how innocent it had seemed at the time. She decided against it, however. He had enough to worry about without her adding that on top. Once more the scene shifted. Naruto began describing dimly lit tunnels, but then abruptly stopped mid-sentence. The words he used sounded very familiar to Kurenai. It took her a moment of thought before she realized that she had read them in one of the reports in the Hokage's dossier on Naruto. They were the same as the ones he used to describe the unusual dream he had just before he acquired an unnatural red eye. She decided that the blonde needed some verbal reassurance. "I know about what's inside you," she said quietly, trying to make her voice as reassuring as possible. "I don't blame you or hold you responsible for anything. You're my student and your welfare is important to me, but I need to know exactly what happened so I can figure out how to deal with it." His silhouette on the shower curtain nodded. A few seconds later Naruto resumed his narrative, this time with noticeably more tension in his voice. He began with the dreams he had a year ago, just before he was incarcerated for 2 months in Anbu headquarters. Kurenai had already read about them from the dossier, but nevertheless it was interesting to hear about them firsthand. He described his first encounter with the girl in his mind and how surreal everything seemed at the time. He then moved on to his second meeting with the girl after he had passed out on the bridge. She could tell by the rhythm of his voice that he was straining to recall and accurately reproduce every detail of the strange encounter. By the time Naruto stopped again, he had recounted everything up to Gatu's appearance from his own perspective. Kurenai in turn filled him in on what he had missed after passing out on the bridge. She used the time while she was speaking to recover her own mental composure. The idea that it might not be the Kyuubi sealed inside Naruto shocked her. What was it that was sealed in him then, and where was the demon fox? She decided to put those questions aside for now. There didn't seem to be any danger of Kyuubi, or whatever the girl in his mind actually was, getting loose in the immediate future. Instead, she put her focus on the things she could deal with at present. So you think that this girl gave you the ability to heal yourself? Kurenai asked. I think so, Naruto replied. The first time she said something about a present, I woke up with my left eye. It just makes sense, I guess. If you're okay with it, I'd like to test that. What do you mean? I want to give you a small cut to see if it heals. I guess. Kurenai waited until he was finished and clothed before motioning for him to sit on the edge of the bathtub. Kneeling before him with a kunai, she quickly drew its blade across the back of his forearm. She watched the cut for a few seconds, but nothing seemed to be happening. I think I have to consciously focus on it, Naruto suggested. When I woke up, nothing happened until I started thinking about my back. Kurenai nodded for him to do so and then watched as the cut sealed itself before her eyes nearly instantaneously. She ran a finger across it, wiping away the blood and revealing undamaged skin underneath. What do you feel when you heal like that? She asked. I can feel a pull on my chakra, and I think there's as much pain as when I got hurt in the first place. When I healed this cut it was just a twinge, but before it felt like my whole back was on fire. She stood up and moved to the sink to wash his blood off her finger and kunai. We should get the full extent of that tested when we get back to Konoha. We really need to know its full abilities and limitations before you try to use it in a real battle. That can wait for later though. Kurenai turned back to Naruto, making eye contact to ensure she had his attention. We're going to have to tell Hokage-sama everything you just told me when we get back. Until then though, it's best if you don't tell anyone else. Given the possibilities, we need to keep things as closely guarded as possible until we're sure of what's going on. I've already ordered Shino and Sakura to consider all details about your part in the fight in S-Class secret until further notice, so when we're done here just follow my lead, okay? Yes, sensei, Naruto replied, his voice quiet and apprehensive. She led him out of the bathroom and back into Tsunami's bedroom, planning how to approach the coming conversation the whole while. When she had agreed to take on a genin team, she thought her duties would include training her students physically and helping them with issues associated with growing up as young shinobi. Helping keep Naruto's secret from his teammates while not even knowing exactly what that secret was herself, and then having to deal with a potential prisoner or recruit for Konoha on top of that was not what she had in mind. She had no doubt that if Anko knew how complicated things had gotten, the trench-coated Takebetsu Jounin would have a front-row seat with Dango's stick in hand, enjoying Kurenai's difficulties and laughing herself silly. Kurenai decided to start with Naruto's situation first. She needed to get Haku's cooperation before putting the girl through the emotional upheaval that was to come. There are a couple things we need to discuss. First, as far as Haku, or I can tell, Naruto's physically fine. Whatever injuries he sustained during the bridge fight and before have healed. But sensei, how? Sakura asked, glancing at Naruto. Is it some kind of special? We don't know yet, that's another thing we'll have to talk to Hokage-sama about. Naruto's never shown this kind of ability before, so it might be an unknown Kekkei Genkai that only manifests under certain conditions. Kurenai didn't like misleading her students. In this case though, it was necessary. She thought that Shino might be perceptive enough to guess she was lying, but hoped that the bug user would keep his silence if he came to that conclusion. For now though, she continued, we need to act as if Haku managed to fully heal him during the night. Since she's already shown her ability with medical ninjutsu, that explanation will seem more natural. Haku, can I get your cooperation on this? I guess so, the raven-haired girl responded with a little uncertainty. Kurenai gave her a slight smile feeling inwardly relieved. She had thought of several ways to coerce or force Haku's cooperation if she was unwilling or asked too many questions. The fact that the girl was being compliant made things easier. Good. There's another thing we need to deal with, and that's you, Haku. Kurenai ended her words with a pointed look. Me? The raven-haired girl asked with a surprised expression. Kurenai turned to her bug user student. Shino, can you please go to the other room and bring the large traveling pack back? You know which I mean. Shino gave his sensei a slight nod before rising to do as asked. When he returned, Kurenai saw the flash of recognition in Haku's eyes. The red-eyed Jounin gestured for Shino to give the pack to its owner and then watched as the raven-haired girl rummaged through the pack to check its contents. She noticed the slight relaxing of Haku's facial expression when the girl came across the storage scroll. Would you mind showing me what's in that storage scroll? Kurenai asked gently. Haku looked up from her pack questioningly. It's just for my own peace of mind, the red-eyed Jounin added. Haku nodded and unrolled the scroll, laying it out flat on the bed she had been using. Though the scroll's vellum exterior cover was in good condition, the yellowed and crackling interior layer of rice paper showed the scroll's age. Kurenai guessed that it was several decades old. The raven-haired girl then brushed her fingertips across the scroll's trigger seal. A second later, a large wooden object appeared on top of the scroll with a light puff of smoke. Kurenai recognized it as a koto. She was familiar with the zither-type musical instrument from lessons during her Chunin days, but had never seen one quite so exquisitely crafted. It was nearly as long as Haku was tall, and the surface was finished in a way that brought the undulating patterns of the wood grain vividly to life. Its 13 strings were stretched over the instrument's slightly curved top, suspended by a series of jade bridges. This is really nice, Kurenai commented. Haku ran a hand lightly over the instrument. It was my mother's, and it's supposed to have been in the family a long time. It was the one thing she would never allow my father to touch. Can you play? My mother taught me when I was little, and I've kept with it ever since. When you're on the road a lot, sometimes you have to create your own entertainment. Kurenai nodded. Thanks for showing it to us. Such a finely made instrument is a treat to see. Haku smiled slightly without looking up as she returned the koto to its storage place within the scroll. She then rolled the scroll itself up and carefully returned it to its position in her pack. Once Haku was finished with her belongings, Kurenai decided that it was best to approach the conversation directly. Zabuza came earlier in the night. I met him in the forest. He left your belongings with me and said he was leaving Wave Country. By now he'll already be gone. Before he left though, he asked me to take you back to Konoha with my team and secure a place for you as a shinobi of the leaf. What? But Zabuza-san, Haku stammered, wide brown eyes moving back and forth between the room's other occupants, as if she was looking for something to anchor herself to. When Zabuza had ordered her to follow the Konoha shinobi, Haku accepted the possibility that they might take her prisoner and force her to go to Konoha with them. Zabuza had always considered Hidden Leaf the softest of the great shinobi villages, but Haku didn't think that even they would be kind enough to simply let an enemy go. Especially when that enemy was also a useful asset in keeping one of their team members alive. She had thought that Zabuza might try to rescue her or do something that would give her an opportunity to attempt an escape herself. The idea that he might simply leave her behind had never occurred to the raven-haired girl. She would have thought that Kurenai was lying, but there was no way for the Konoha shinobi to have gotten her pack without Zabuza giving it to them. Was Zabuza throwing her away because she lost against Naruto? Had she failed him so badly that she no longer was of any use to him? Haku closed her eyes tightly and put her head in her hands, trying to make sense of the situation. She had been with Zabuza for nearly as long as she could remember. She couldn't imagine living any other way. He had been the foundation upon which she had built her life, and now that he was gone she felt small and helpless. Once again it felt like her entire world was falling to pieces around her. The sensation of a hand being gently placed on her shoulder startled her out of her thoughts. Haku looked up to see that Kurenai was standing beside her, a kindly smile on the older woman's face. She had been so distracted by her own thoughts that she hadn't noticed a red-eyed Jounin approaching. I know that this must be difficult for you, that you're feeling a lot of uncertainty right now, Kurenai said gently. I'm sure that Zabuza only had your interests at heart though. He said that he wanted you to have a chance at a stable and happy life rather than always being on the run with him. He did? Zabuza-san said that? Haku asked, a glimmer of life returning to her eyes. Kurenai simply nodded at the girl. She chose not to repeat the other part of what Zetsubou had said about his reasons. There would be nothing to gain from it at this point. You don't have to make up your mind right away. Now that we don't have to rush Naruto back to Konoha, we'll be here a couple more days while the bridge is finished. If you want to, when dawn breaks you can try to go after Zetsubou. I won't stop you if that's what you really want to do. If you're willing to give it a try though, I'm sure you'll find a place for yourself in Konoha. I'll think about it. Kurenai gave Haku's shoulder a final reassuring squeeze before moving back to her chair. In truth, she had no intention of letting Haku go after Zetsubou if that was what the girl wanted to do. Kurenai had said it because giving Haku the illusion of freedom and then persuading her to choose Konoha of her free will would help build a positive rapport with the girl. If she chose differently, however, Kurenai was fully prepared to take whatever measures she needed to ensure that Haku ended up in Konoha anyway. The girl had already seen too much concerning Naruto. While she might not be able to put the pieces together herself, someone who knew more about Konoha's history certainly could. Zetsubou did say something that I'm curious about though, Kurenai continued once she was seated again. I asked what if you refused to go to Konoha with me, and his words were ask her about the first lesson I taught her and then tell her that she has fulfilled hers to me. Haku's head snapped back up. Zetsubou-san said that? Kurenai nodded. I'm curious as to what it means. Haku drew her legs to her chest and put her arms around them, her eyes downcast and lackluster. It was several seconds before she replied in a subdued voice. I didn't have a good childhood. When Zetsubou-san found me, I was living on the streets by myself. If he hadn't taken me in, I would probably have been dead by now or worse. She hugged her knees tightly to her chest. When Zetsubou-san decided to train me to be useful to him, the first thing he taught me was to always fulfill my obligations, always repay my debts, no matter the cost. He never let me forget it and said it was the most important thing he could ever teach me. Kurenai could understand why Zetsubou had emphasized that point. It was a good creed to live by in general for those who walk the path of a shinobi. In Haku's case, however, the mist swordsman could also use that lesson to subtly reinforce the girl's loyalty to him personally. It was a tool that Kurenai could use as well. Is that why you decided to heal Naruto? The red-eyed Jounin asked. He saved your life and you felt obligated? I guess so, the raven-haired girl replied, eyes not meeting Kurenai or her genin team. I don't know, I wasn't really thinking clearly at the time. It was just something I felt I had to do. Well, whatever reasons you did it for, I appreciate it. Thanks, Naruto said quietly. Haku turned to Naruto with a surprised look, then gave the blonde a tentative smile. Kurenai glanced out the room's one large window, seeing that the darkness of the night was starting to fade away. The window overlooked the small garden on the house's eastern side, and in the right lighting conditions the distant low mountain range that dominated Wave Country's eastern side was just visible through the surrounding mists. Kurenai could just see them now, their peaks illuminated with a red hue in anticipation of the coming sunrise. She turned back to Haku. It looks like the sunrise isn't far off, so there's no point in going back to bed. Instead, since we might be traveling together in the near future, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself? She had several purposes in mind with her question. Finding out about Haku's background was the obvious goal, though Kurenai already knew a bit from Zetsubou's comments during the fight on the bridge. Getting Haku to talk about herself would also make her feel more at ease with Kurenai and her students. Finally, having her students hear about Haku's past would humanize the raven-haired girl for them, making her more than just an ex-enemy and perhaps causing them to treat her with more kindness and less suspicion. Both were positive steps towards convincing the girl to go willingly to Konoha. Haku hesitated. There's not much to tell really. Kurenai simply gave the girl a reassuring smile and waited. Sometimes the best response was no response. Well, I was born in a rural village in Water Country, on one of the small eastern islands. My father farmed a small plot of land, and my mother made some money as the village's healer. Did you learn how to use Shosen Jutsu from her? Kurenai asked. Haku nodded. Sort of. She wasn't a ninja, but she had been passed down the family. My mother didn't actually teach me, but she told me enough about how it was done that, when Zetsubou-san started training me, I was able to put the rest together myself. Kurenai nodded. Go on. We weren't well off. It was a poor village, and everyone just barely got by. But I remember we were happy. My parents' eyes always lit up when they looked at each other, and they always made time for me. The villagers were always nice to me too. I was the only child my age in the village, and adults would give me sweets or stop to play with me. Haku looked out the window, the corners of her mouth turned upwards in a small smile. Her eyes were unfocused, as if she were seeing memories of happier times. She allowed herself to be lost in her recollections for a minute before continuing her story. Everything changed when I discovered my Kekkei Genkai. I was so proud, I didn't understand at the time why my mother was so afraid. It was the only time in my life I could remember mom hitting me. She made me promise not to show anyone, but my father had already seen it. Haku had visibly shrunk into herself now, reliving in her mind the most painful episode of her young life. He killed her. He brought a mob of villagers to the house, and they beat my mom to death right in front of me. They were going to kill me too, but I panicked and lost control of my ability. The house exploded with ice shards, and all the villagers were dead before I realized what had happened. I killed them all. I don't understand, Sakura asked with a confused tone. Why did he do it? Haku had put her head down to her knees with her eyes closed, and her hands were shaking slightly. Kurenai decided to answer Sakura's question herself to give the raven-haired girl a chance to regain her composure. Water Country has a history of civil wars. Because of Hidden Mist's remoteness from the mainland, their shinobi don't often get involved in international conflicts. Instead, they get hired for internal Water Country power struggles. The civilian population suffered most from these wars, caught in the middle and attacked by both sides in order to deny civilian support to each other. Those with Kekkei Genkai were seen as symbols of destruction because their abilities were the most visible. After the last war, there was a bloodline purge, and they were killed off because people were afraid their existence would lead to more wars. That doesn't seem logical, Shino observed. Those with bloodline limits aren't any more or less responsible for wars than those without. Ultimately, those who instigated the civil wars were simply using all shinobi, bloodline or not, for their own purposes. Kurenai shrugged. People don't always act logically. In fact, they usually don't. If you can understand and exploit that, you can potentially gain a useful advantage over an adversary. She turned back to Haku. Zabuza found you after that? Haku nodded without looking up. I ran away from the village and eventually ended up in one of the towns on Water Country's main island. That's where Zabuza-san found me. He took me in and trained me without knowing about my ability, and even when he found out, he kept me around. Why didn't he put you in the academy? I don't really know, Zabuza-san never said anything about it. I think maybe even then he was thinking about rebelling against a Mizukage, and he kept me secret as a possible trump card. Then when he left Kiri, I went along because I didn't have ties to anyone except him. Kurenai glanced out the window again. The sun had fully crested the eastern mountains, while Haku shared her life story and was now bathing the countryside with the warmth of its early morning light. She turned back to study Haku's facial expression. If she had a good sense of how the raven-haired girl was currently feeling, she just needed to apply one last gentle nudge before Haku would end up choosing Konoha of her own free will. I know that things must be pretty confusing right now. If you ever need anyone to talk to about anything, you can always come to me. I promise I'll help you as much as I can, Kurenai said gently while giving Haku a warm smile. She then addressed her students. It's about time to get the day started, so go and see what you can help with during morning chores. Naruto, I want you to take it easy for the next couple days, just in case. No training and nothing physically strenuous. If anything even feels odd or hurt, tell me right away. Now get going, and remember, Haku fully healed Naruto during the night. She watched as Shino and Naruto stood and walked out of the room, followed shortly after by Haku. Sakura did not move to follow them. Kurenai could tell that something was bothering Sakura and had been ever since the fight on the bridge. With everything else that had been going on, though she had never found a good chance to talk to her female student privately. Now was as good a time as any, the red-eyed Jounin supposed. Sakura? The pink-haired girl kept her face turned away, not meeting her sensei's gaze. She mumbled something that Kurenai couldn't quite catch. The Jounin moved to sit beside Sakura on the bed that Naruto had occupied. Sakura? What is it? I don't know if I can keep doing this anymore, sensei. Her tone was hesitant and dejected. What do you mean, Sakura? You know you can come to me if you have any problems. It's just that I'm not a useful part of the team. Every time we get into a fight, I freeze up. In the forest, all I could do was run away. And on the bridge, I froze up and Naruto almost died. Maybe if I could have helped. Kurenai decided to interrupt Sakura at that point. She couldn't afford one of her students having confidence issues in the middle of a mission. That was something she could deal with more thoroughly once they returned to Konoha. Sakura, stop thinking like that. Not every shinobi is strong at fighting. You contribute to the team in other ways. And things turned out well enough in the end. But I'm going to tell you something I told Naruto. Being a ninja isn't all about fighting, that's what thugs do. Skill in combat is important, and it's something I can help you improve over time. But there are other aspects to being a ninja, and this is where your strengths lie. You're the smartest member of the team, and you have the best interpersonal skills. Those are valuable assets for diplomacy or information gathering type missions. Also, as far as I know, no other genin team has anything resembling a specialized medic, and that's a role you're fulfilling on this team. Well, but Sakura, Kurenai said forcefully, have some faith in your own abilities. I know that Naruto and Shino don't think you're useless. Their strengths cover your weaknesses, just like your strengths cover theirs. That's how a ninja team operates. I guess so. Kurenai could see that, though the pink-haired girl accepted her words, there was still some lingering doubt. The red-eyed Jounin decided to focus Sakura's energies towards a productive task for the present so that she wouldn't have time to dwell on her doubts. Actually, there's something I'd like you to do that suits your abilities. I want you to try and get friendly with Haku, see if you can strike up a rapport with her. Why, sensei? Sakura gave her instructor a puzzled look. I want her to feel comfortable around us. She was closest to Naruto when his ability manifested, and until I can talk to Hokage-sama about it, I'm not comfortable having that information spread. It's best if we can convince her to return to Konoha with us, and that's more likely to happen if she feels some bond of friendship with you. There's also the fact that you can ask her for pointers on medical ninjutsu. That will help you with your own goal, as well. Sakura nodded. I'll try. Kurenai smiled at her. Good, that's all I ask. Now let's go downstairs and rejoin the group. If we're missing for too long, they'll start wondering about us. The red-eyed Jounin watched Sakura's retreating form as her student left the room. She had said what she needed to in order to temporarily bolster the girl's confidence, but hadn't actually addressed the root of the problem. She began putting ideas together in her head to deal with the issue once the team returned to Konoha. Kurenai felt another presence approaching Tazuna's house near the end of breakfast, but this time it was a familiar and entirely non-threatening one. Well, she supposed that whether this was truly non-threatening was really in the eye of the beholder. She moved to open the door, then stepped aside as two indistinct green blurs flew through the doorway into Tazuna's dining room. Double dynamic entry. Kurenai turned to find two vaguely humanoid figures crouched down on the floor before Tazuna's dining table, back to back, and arms held out in bizarre ways. To her mind, they looked like poses straight out of Super Sentai television shows popular with children in Konoha. Except that the Sentai team was composed entirely of disturbingly green individuals. Having no frame of reference by which they could understand what they were seeing, the other occupants of the house found themselves completely at a loss. Tsunami responded by shrieking and dropping her frying pan. Tazuna began choking on a mouthful of rice, while Inari started with white eyes and a face that showed a curious mix of awe and horror. Haku was frozen in shock, chopsticks falling from lifeless fingers and clattering on the table. Sakura was in a similar state, though she had been luckier in not having anything in her hands at the time. Even Shino's eyebrows had risen nearly to his hairline. Besides Kurenai herself, the only occupant of the room not surprised by speechlessness was Naruto. Lee, the blonde asked uncertainly, what happened to you? Did you join a cult or something? Sakura turned her shocked expression at her teammate. Naruto, you know these guys? Well, Naruto replied, I never leaving the dynamically green duo, the shorter one's Rock Lee. He was in the academy a year ahead of us. After I got out of my coma, I needed to rebuild my physical fitness, so I looked for someone to help me set up a training routine. I ended up getting help from Lee, but at the time he wasn't like this. Naruto-san. My fellow traveler on the path of hard work, it is good to see that you still remember me. Lee exclaimed with one arm thrust out in a vigorous thumbs-up gesture. Yeah. So back to my question, and depending on the answer I may deny ever knowing you. Did you join a cult or something, Lee? Is that why you're dressed like a miniature version of that guy? Naruto pointed at the imposingly green man standing beside Lee. This is my team's Jounin instructor, Guy-sensei. Your sensei? Is he making you dress like him? Is that even legal? Naruto asked dubiously. "You are very much mistaken, my young friend," declared Guy in a booming voice. "Lee has chosen to adopt this attire as a symbol of his will to fan the flames of his determination into an unquenchable inferno of youth. It's through such determination that he will ultimately become a genius of hard work." Naruto started, but he was cut off by Lee's loud proclamation. "Guy-sensei. Lee. Guy-sensei. Lee." Kurenai decided that it would be prudent for her to intervene at this point before the situation was completely sidetracked by Guy and his students' youthfulness. "Guy, you're scaring the civilians. And was it really necessary to come in with such a flashy entrance?" Konoha's noble green beast turned to her with a gleaming smile that was simply unnatural given the early time of day. "It's such a beautiful morning, Kurenai-san, my adorable student, and I couldn't help but express the burning flames of our youth with our bodies." Kurenai decided that she didn't want to touch Guy's words with the metaphorical 10-foot pole. "So are you the backup that I messaged for?" "Indeed. My students and I were just returning to Konoha after a mission when we were relayed orders to come here and assist your team in dealing with an unexpectedly youthful villain." "I suppose Mamachi Zabuza could be considered youthful," Kurenai mused, "but your team's too late. We fought it out with Zabuza and his apprentice yesterday." Guy's giant fuzzy eyebrows rose. "You and your genin team were able to defeat one of the 7 swordsmen and his apprentice?" "Something like that, I'll explain the details to you later." "Where's the rest of your team?" "They're a little bit behind. Unfortunately, at this hour in the morning the fires of Niji and Tenten's youth have not been sufficiently stoked yet." Even as Guy finished, Kurenai could see his other 2 students approaching Tazuna's house. She recognized the boy immediately by his distinctive eyes. Hyuga Niji, said to be a prodigy of a level that comes along only once every few generations, was walking with his eyes fixed straight ahead and his face plainly showing his cold disinterest in the world around him. Kurenai couldn't bring to mind the name of the girl beside him, looking around at everything with an expression that was the perfect opposite to Niji's. She vaguely recalled reading something about the girl using thrown weapons though. Once everyone had arrived and introductions were completed, Kurenai pulled Guy aside to fill him in on how the mission had gone so far. The red-eyed Jounin deliberately omitted much of Naruto's involvement, trusting Guy to not second-guess her in the matter due to his sense of professionalism. She only told him that she needed to return to Konoha as soon as possible to get Naruto checked out medically and to discuss certain things with the Hokage. "I know it's unusual," Kurenai continued, "but if we temporarily switch teams I could take Naruto and Haku with your genin back to Konoha right away. Meanwhile you could stay with Shino and Sakura until the bridge is built to fulfill the terms of the contract." Guy rubbed his chin thoughtfully. What Kurenai was asking of him certainly was an unorthodox solution to her problem, though there was solid logic behind it. "How about this, Kurenai-san?" Guy finally said. "We'll simply completely switch roles. I'll stay behind with my students while you take your team and Haku-san back to Konoha." "That wouldn't be fair to your team though, Guy. You're just returning from a mission, right? They shouldn't have to stay in the field to complete my team's mission." "Don't worry about that," Guy assured her. "Had you not overcome the villainous Zabuza before we arrived, we would be staying here anyway. Helping with bridge building will be good training for Lee. And it would be a good experience for young Niji to be exposed to ways of living beyond what he normally sees as part of the prestigious Hyuga clan." "If you're really sure about it, Guy," Kurenai said. "Of course, it will be no problem." Guy said the last words with vigor, emphasizing them with the nice guy pose, thumb extended and teeth flashing. Team 8 departed from Tazuna's house shortly after lunch. As Kurenai had expected, in the end Haku chose to accompany her team back to Konoha. At the beginning of the journey the raven-haired girl had been visibly depressed. Kurenai could empathize with her feelings. She had suddenly been uprooted from everything she had known before and was now walking towards an uncertain future in a village she knew nothing about. As Kurenai had suggested, Sakura took the lead in befriending Haku during the journey. The pink-haired Kunoichi asked the taller girl about places she had visited with Zabuza, regaled her with descriptions of Konoha and its people, engaged her in idle chatter about clothing or music, and otherwise did what she could to keep Haku from dwelling on her depression. Shino offered the occasional comment as well, while Naruto stayed mostly silent during the trip. Sakura's efforts eventually began to have an effect. As the sun approached the western horizon and the shadows around them lengthened, Haku's initially polite but curt acknowledgements of the other girl's words had grown to more relaxed and natural responses and even occasionally questions as Haku asked about certain aspects of Konoha that interested her. By the time they stopped to camp for the night, Sakura had convinced Haku to begin teaching her the basics of Shaosen Jutsu. Teammate plus Haku broke camp just past dawn the next morning, foregoing breakfast at camp in anticipation of getting a proper meal once they were back in Konoha. As the sun approached the apex of its arc across the sky, they found themselves standing before the village's large eastern gate. Kurenai moved ahead and flashed her ID card and mission orders at the Chunin gate guards. Yui Kurenai and Genin team returning from a mission, +1 foreign shinobi. We need to see Hokage-sama right away. She needs to be present as well, I'll vouch for her, she said as she briefly tilted her head to indicate Haku. Allowing an unknown foreign shinobi to meet with the Hokage was a major security concern, and it would not be allowed at all were it not one of Konoha's few elite jounin making the request. Even so, Kurenai knew that there would be numerous Anbu shadowing her group the second they stepped through the gate. Just give me a few minutes here, Yui-san. There seems to be some discrepancy with the paperwork, one of the Chunin said, even as another sped away towards the center of the village. Kurenai simply nodded and moved closer to look over the paperwork with the Chunin. In truth, this was just a delaying tactic to give the Anbu time to set up an unobtrusive escort detail. A few minutes later, the Chunin handed the papers back to her. I'm sorry, Yui-san. That was my mistake. It looks like everything's in order after all. You may proceed directly to the Hokage's office with your team and guests. Kurenai motioned for Haku and her Genin team to follow, and they stepped in line behind her as she walked through the gate and onto the main thoroughfare that led to the Hokage Tower. Now that they were home and nearly finished with the mission, Kurenai could see that there was new energy in the way Shino and Sakura moved. As carefully controlled as his actions normally were, Shino still revealed his happiness at finally being home in the way he stood a little straighter than before. Sakura was chattering animatedly, pointing out shops and other Konoha landmarks to Haku as they passed. In turn, the taller girl was looking at everything with an expression approaching wonder. As missing Nin typically avoided large concentrations of people to reduce the possibility of someone recognizing them, Kurenai supposed that a busy village like Konoha was quite a sight for Haku. The only one who didn't look entirely happy to be back in Konoha was Naruto, though Kurenai could understand his feelings. They had put off discussing the implications of what had happened on the bridge. Now that they were about to report to the Hokage though, it couldn't be avoided any longer. It did not take long for them to reach the Hokage Tower, where they were immediately waved through by the Chunin on guard duty. As she led Haku and her team up through the tower, she once more mentally reviewed the words she would use in reporting the mission. This was far from the first time she had been on a mission that warranted a direct report to the Hokage, but this was her first C rank as a jounin instructor. Given just how complicated things had turned out, she wanted to be as precise in her wording as possible at every stage of her report. Then and I decided it would be best if I returned to Konoha right away with my team and Haku, while he stayed behind with his team to finish the mission. Saratobi here is allowed a minute to pass in silence after Kurenai finished reporting on teammates' mission, using it to study the faces of the people assembled in his office. The team's jounin instructor kept her face carefully neutral, a skill she had honed through years of practice and experience. The Aburame boy was as reserved with his expressions as the rest of his clan, though Saratobi had enough experience dealing with the bug users to see hints of impatience. The Haruno girl, on the other hand, was as terrible at hiding her emotions as the bug user was good at it. She was tired, nervous, and something else he couldn't quite identify. He decided to ask Kurenai about it later. He had taken note of Kurenai's vagueness when it came to Naruto's role in the second fight between Team 8 and Zabuza. He chose not to bring notice to it at the time, though seeing the way the blonde was acting now he could venture a guess. Throughout the entire briefing, Naruto had been unnaturally subdued. His eyes were focused on a spot on the floor near the Hokage's desk, and he had not once looked up to make eye contact. Naruto's lips were drawn into a thin line, and though he tried to hide it, Saratobi could see the apprehension in his face. Two possibilities came immediately to the Hokage's mind. The first was that Naruto had somehow failed catastrophically or committed a large enough mistake for his instructor to harshly rebuke him, and he was now questioning whether he had a future as a shinobi of the leaf at all. That struck Saratobi as unlikely, though. He didn't think Kurenai was the sort to put down her charges like that without then trying to build them back up. The other likely possibility was one he really didn't want to deal with. The Hokage decided to deal with Haku first, turning from Naruto to study the girl. Though she hid it better, he could tell that she was even more nervous than the Haruno girl. It was an understandable reaction. She was standing before someone who literally had the power of life and death over her. As a former enemy nin, there were certain hidden villages where she would immediately find herself imprisoned and tortured, with execution being one of the more preferable options afterwards. Konoha's open and accepting policy towards Kekkei Genkai users was one of the reasons it had grown strong though. As the last survivor of such a potentially powerful bloodline, Haku would be a valuable addition to Konoha's forces. But there was always the issue of trust. "Your name is Haku, right?" Sarutobi asked using his best grandfatherly tone. The raven-haired girl nodded nervously. "Yes, Hokage-sama. What's your impression of Konoha so far?" "It's different. I only saw a little bit coming here, but the streets are so colorful and lively. It's not like what I remember of Kiri." Sarutobi smiled at her. "Would you like to stay here, or would you like to return to Zabuza? You've already done us a service by healing one of our wounded. If you wanted, I could arrange for you to be reunited with Zabuza. It wouldn't be very difficult to track him down with Konoha's intelligence network." The Hokage saw that her eyes briefly lit up before her expression settled. "I think I should stay. Zabuza-san wanted me to find a place for myself here." Sarutobi considered Haku's response a small point in her favor. Showing any hint of attachment to her old life made her less desirable for Leaf. On the other hand, it was that bit of hesitation which made it less likely that she was a plant trying to infiltrate the village. "I'm sure you won't have any difficulty finding a place in Konoha for yourself. Now if you would, please follow Shiranui-kun." The Hokage waved his hand to indicate the bandana-wearing Takebetsu Jounin standing by the door with it in his mouth. "He'll take you to be debriefed. It's a routine process." Haku bowed deeply to the Hokage before turning to follow the Takebetsu Jounin out the door. Once he was sure that they were out of earshot, Sarutobi turned to the other shinobi guarding the door. "Saragaku-kun, please go to Ibiki and tell him to use a soft approach in interrogating her. This one may be useful to us in the future." "Yes, Hokage-sama," the Chunin replied before bowing and hurrying out of the office. Sarutobi turned back to Team 8, still assembled before him. "Your mission pay will be deposited in your accounts by the end of the day, and I would like to personally commend each of you for successfully carrying this mission out despite the unexpectedly difficult odds. Now, if there's nothing else, you're all dismissed." Kurenai bowed to the Hokage with her students following shortly after, though Naruto's bow was stiff and unnatural. She turned to her students as she straightened her posture. "You guys can go now. Take the next couple days off to rest and catch up with your lives. I'll contact you when I want to hold team meetings again." The red-eyed Jounin made no move to leave and put her hand on Naruto's shoulder to indicate that he should stay as well. Sakura hesitated and gave her sensei a curious look, but Shino grabbed her by the elbow and guided the pink-haired girl out of the Hokage's office. Sarutobi counted out several seconds after his office door closed once more before speaking again. "I presume that there's more we need to talk about?" "Yes, sir, there was something I didn't feel comfortable discussing in front of Haku and the rest of Team 8. The Hokage studied Kurenai's expression for several seconds, noting the slight narrowing of the eyes and tightening of the lips that told him of her unease. Finally, he gave several hand signals that sent the hidden Anbu guarding his office away and activated the room's privacy seals. The red-eyed Jounin waited for him to finish before motioning for Naruto to begin retelling the events of the mission from his perspective. As Naruto spoke, the Hokage felt a throbbing pressure build in his head, somewhere between his eyes. By the time the blonde had finished and silence once again fell over the office, Sarutobi was leaning back in his chair with his hands rubbing at his temples, not bothering to hide his tired expression. After a few seconds of rubbing, he gave up and reached for his pipe instead, hoping that the soothing tobacco flavor could at least take the edge off his headache. Once he had methodically filled the bowl of his pipe, he lit it and took a long pull before speaking. "There are two possibilities underlying all of this. The first is that the girl you met in your vision, I suppose, is Kyuubi, and it was lying to you. The other alternative is that she didn't lie and is really something else." Sarutobi supposed a third possibility existed, that all of Team 8 and Haku shared a communal mass delusion and none of the extraordinary events on the bridge actually occurred. That would require deactivating an elite Jounin and 3 promising genin for some very thorough psychiatric evaluation. But that was still preferable to either of the other alternatives. He quickly dismissed the idea as absurd wishful thinking, however. If it's Kyuubi, why would she lie? Naruto asked. It's a demon, the Hokage replied. We can't assume that it has human motives or thought patterns. It may have some long-term goal we have no idea of, or it may simply be doing it for its own amusement. Sarutobi lightly tapped his pipe to shift the tobacco around in the bowl and took another long pull before speaking again. I think the alternative is more likely though, with the way the two of you described the chakra flare. If it's not Kyuubi, then… Sarutobi finished Kurenai's sentence even as the thought came to her mind. The Shinigami. There were only 3 mystical creatures of great power on the battlefield that night, the Kyuubi, the Shinigami, and Gamabunta. We know that Gamabunta hasn't been sealed away, so if it's not the Kyuubi then there's only one alternative left. Naruto turned a questioning expression to the Hokage. Gamabunta? The boss frog summon, Sarutobi explained. The fourth was one of the holders of the frog summoning contract, and he used Gamabunta as a distraction until he could complete the summoning for the Shinigami. The Hokage paused to take another pull from his pipe. The fourth's original plan was to first use an S-rank technique called Shiki Fuijin to summon a Shinigami in order to tear out the Kyuubi's essence from its physical shell. Then he was to use Shishu Fuin to seal it inside of Naruto. He was worried that Shishu Fuin wouldn't be able to hold the demon fox's chakra though. As possibly the greatest seal master that Konoha ever produced, he eventually chose to use an original seal design that he named Tensa Fuin. It's so complex that none of Konoha's regular seal experts were able to tell me much of its working. Even Jiraiya of the Sannin, the fourth's teacher and currently one of the most skilled seal masters in the elemental nations, wasn't able to fully decipher the workings of the seal when he saw it. Tensa Fuin, Heavenly Chain's seal, Naruto repeated to himself. The blonde then looked up at the Hokage with a spark of understanding in his eyes. The girl, Shinigami, whatever, she knew the whole time. What do you mean, Naruto? When we fought Zabuza in the forest he asked me what my sword's name was. I had never thought about something like that because it seemed odd to name a wooden sword I made myself. When I gave it a little thought though, the name Tensa Kayakatsu came to my mind, like she was sending it to me. And then there's the web of chains with the seal stuck on it in the cavern in my dreams. Sarutobi leaned forward in his chair and steepled his fingers together as he gave the matter some thought. Heavenly chains, crazy bones, combining the name of the seal and a description of what's locked away inside your mind. It makes sense. But the girl is a problem though, she's not sealed away behind the web of chains. She said that the bone thing was her other self, maybe she's part of the Shinigami? Naruto suggested. Sarutobi nodded once. That's what I was thinking. The shinobi who were close enough to have seen the fourths described the Shinigami as some kind of large bone creature. We really don't know anything about them, what they are, or how they work. There are a few very high-level shinobi techniques that use them or their powers, and there are ancient mythical stories of people meeting or even becoming Shinigami. It might be that those myths are true. The girl could have gone through something like that, and one of the effects of the sealing was to separate her two halves. The Hokage paused for a moment before adding, of course, in their own way Shinigami are just as alien and inhuman as the Kyuubi, so we really can't be sure of anything. There's also the fact that Tensa Fuin wasn't intended for the Shinigami at all. We don't know what effect the seal actually had. What about Kyuubi? Kurenai asked. Sarutobi shook his head. Shiki Fuijin's purpose is to tear a human's soul out and capture it within the Shinigami. The fourth added the second sealing step because he believed that the Kyuubi would be able to escape from that eventually. It's possible that the Kyuubi is currently sealed within the Shinigami, even as the Shinigami itself is sealed within Naruto. The Kyuubi could also have been destroyed during the sealing, its physical form at least. Perhaps there's enough of it with the Shinigami that it's unable to reform itself. We're in completely uncharted territory with this. Kyuubi hasn't been sighted anywhere in the last 12 years though, so I feel we can put that problem aside to deal with the more immediate one. The Hokage leaned back once again, taking one final long pull from his pipe before upending the bowl and dumping its contents into the ashtray on one side of his desk. Though he knew it was necessary, he wasn't looking forward to saying the words forming in his mind. He drew out the act of refilling his pipe, carefully packing the tobacco, taking his time as a welcome delay of the inevitable. Finally the pipe was filled to his satisfaction. Sarutobi gave his pipe one last longing look before putting it aside with a sigh. First, I want the two of you to understand that none of what we just discussed can leave this room. I'm officially classifying it as an S-class secret. The Hokage punctuated his words with sharp stares at each of the two other occupants of his office. Naruto nodded solemnly, but Kurenai spoke up. Hokage-sama, I think it might be a prudent idea to include Anko and the other members of Team 8 since they interact with Naruto on a regular basis. I've already told Shino and Sakura to keep everything about his role in the fight confidential. Haku, as well, if she proves trustworthy. They witnessed the situation firsthand, and it would be more suspicious if we didn't give them some kind of explanation. Sarutobi considered her suggestion for a few moments before nodding. Very well, that's reasonable. I'll leave the final decision up to the two of you. For everyone else though, stick to the established story of the Kyuubi being sealed inside of Naruto. If possible, don't refer to Kyuubi at all. We can pass off the healing ability as an unknown Kekkei Genkai, and if word doesn't spread about how the mission went, we can bypass having to explain the Chakra Flare event completely. Next, I'm putting Team 8 on probation until further notice. Naruto cut in, with his tone tightly controlled. It's because of what happened to me, isn't it? You need to make sure I'm safe. Like before. Sarutobi gave his surrogate grandchild a sad smile. I'm sorry Naruto, but, as Hokage, I need to put the safety of the village first. I wish there were another way, but I have to be sure. Naruto nodded, the downcast expression on his face carefully restrained. I understand. I'll go to Ibiki by myself. You don't have to send an escort to Jiji. Kurenai didn't know what else to do, so she put her hand on the blonde's shoulder and gently squeezed in what she hoped was a comforting way. When he turned to her, the red-eyed Jounin gave Naruto a smile of her own. It'll be okay Naruto. It'll be over in no time, and your teammates and I will be waiting for you. Naruto nodded once more before turning and leaving the Hokage's office. Sarutobi felt conflicting emotions flowing through him as he watched Naruto's retreating form. His heart was heavy at having to once again put Naruto through interrogation and medical examination for events that were entirely beyond the blonde's control. On the other hand, he felt pride at the way the boy accepted what was necessary and walked towards it of his own free will. Naruto had endured more than what anyone of his age should be asked and had emerged from it better than anyone had a right to expect. Sarutobi closed his eyes, allowing his mind to linger briefly on one thought even as the image of his successor as Hokage came to the surface. You would be proud of him, Minato. When the Hokage opened his eyes again, he found teammates Jounin instructor still standing before him. Is there still more to the mission? Sarutobi asked. No Hokage-sama, but there's something else, and I thought I could take the opportunity to bring it up with you. Sarutobi studied the Kunoichi standing before him. With her being one of Konoha's few elite Jounin, and also being the village's foremost expert on, he had interacted with Kurenai enough through mission briefings and other meetings that the aged Hokage felt he had a good grasp of her personality. She was acting very uncharacteristically now, with slight shifts in body posture and facial expression betraying her nervousness to Sarutobi's experienced eyes. He decided to broach the question directly, rather than spend time trying to puzzle it out on his own. What's on your mind, Kurenai-kun? Well, I have some concerns with my team. I've thought up a number of steps I could take to address them, but they're highly unorthodox. I don't know if I should be considering them at all. I also have some ideas about how to deal with Haku, as well, if you decide that she's useful to Konoha as a shinobi. The Hokage smiled at Kurenai encouragingly. I don't have anything pressing on my schedule, so feel free to lay out your ideas. Perhaps, in dealing with such a unique situation, unorthodox solutions are what we need. Thanks for watching my video, leave a like if you enjoyed my video, and also do consider subscribing to my channel for more awesome content. If you want the next part of this story, let me know in the comment box. See you next time, till then sayonara.